Hello and welcome back to this Downful Idealistic Crusade. This video will be a review of Criterion's Spine 1036, their wonderful box set entitled Bruce Lee, His Greatest Hits. This, of course, compiles the feature filmography of Bruce Lee, the filmography that was so tragically cut short, so it means you essentially are only dealing with 4 completed theatrical films and then one that was only partially completed, so 4.5 really. It is packed with a great number of supplemental features and alternate audio tracks, and in a lot of ways is really the go-to presentation for these films in terms of a box set package nowadays. These films have had a very long and storied release history, both theatrically and in video terms, varying edits, varying dubs, varying subtitle tracks, varying titles. So it's not an easy thing to make a definitive package for these films that has absolutely everything. But I think Criterion did a pretty good job at making a package that gets the majority of essential things into one place. I don't think it's perfect, but I do think it is now the best go-to source for these films and has some exclusives that I think are really important. So I do think it is the best place to start if you're new to Bruce Lee's filmography. And to be quite honest, I myself had only seen Enter the Dragon all the way through before getting this set and digging through it. So I was really looking forward to seeing all these films fresh for the first time. I'd always seen them in terms of clip compilations, or I'd seen part of them in varying versions, but I'd never sat down and actually watched Bruce Lee's filmography start to finish in chronological order with the correct original mono Mandarin soundtracks and proper English subtitles in new transfers. And to be honest, I had always tried to figure out how to see these films properly because it was very confusing on most video releases that had differing versions, differing soundtracks. This got complicated even further when Shout Factory did their initial Blu-ray releases from new transfers, but then those had varying issues, particularly in the color timing on the new masters. So they wound up recalling their original box set and reissuing it in a new form that had a different extras package, but had color corrections that Shout Factory did themselves. Of course, they were working on masters provided to them by Fortune Star, so even though they were 4K, they are being sourced from somebody else. Now, the bulk of these 4K transfers were reused for Criterion's box set, and then Criterion has done their own color timing work on those specific titles. So this is a mix of 4K transfers from Fortune Star and also some 2K transfers from Warner MPI for Enter the Dragon. So it is a little bit of a mix there, but it is working off of some of the same materials that Shout Factory used. So there is some debate on those 4K source titles, whether you prefer the color timing and mastering choices of the Shout Factory releases or the Criterion release. And also on top of that, Criterion does sort of borrow a lot of Shout's extras that they created for their box set, but not all of them. So if you are a completist or you are fascinated by Bruce Lee's filmography or you're a diehard fan, you will want to hang on to the various Shout box sets or track some of that material down if you want every last extra. I do think Criterion was able to utilize a lot of the heart of those materials, but of course, do keep in mind this box set is merely cherry picking from both Shout releases and other home video releases in the past in terms of the extras, in addition to Criterion creating some of their own new extras. So that's why I think it's a good sort of go-to for people to go to if they want one set of Bruce Lee's filmography that has all the essentials and has a lot of great additional bonus material. But again, I must stress this set is not 100% definitive. It would be very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to license every last scrap of material and also include every last iteration of each of the films because, again, ever since their original release, they have had different presentations and varying versions and new audio mixes created. So it's a very challenging task to make any sort of box set for the Bruce Lee filmography. So I guess what what I'll do is talk a little bit about each of the films in chronological order, and then talk about each film's transfer in terms of the picture transfer, the audio options, and the extras per each disc. And I figured that's probably the easiest way to talk about each film and give them each a little bit of coverage, and then I'll move on to the final packaging overview. So, of course, the first film that really exploded Bruce Lee onto the cinematic scene across the world was 1971's The Big Boss, directed by Lo Wei. This film is very important because it really shows you the crossroads that Hong Kong cinema was at the time that Bruce Lee came over from America, after having at least some success in both the martial arts field and also some success primarily after playing Kato on the short-lived Green Hornet series, which was a spin-off of the iconic 1966 Batman series. And unfortunately, that series has never had an official home video release, so the only way to ever see any of that footage of Bruce Lee as Kato on an official release, you have to look at the crossover episodes in the Batman 66 Blu-ray, which is why I have it behind me here. That's an important touchstone of Lee's career, because when he later went to Hong Kong after still not having getting any traction, trying to get his acting career off the ground, and here in the States, he found that he was almost essentially a legend overnight as Kato. And of course, they even billed the Green Hornet as literally the Kato show. So a lot of things sort of converged, and Lee was offered some various deals with film companies, and he wound up deciding to sign with Raymond Chow in the early days of what was Golden Harvest. So the first film produced was indeed The Big Boss. And the reason why I think this film is so important is, as I said, it is a meeting of two completely different styles. Bruce Lee was not really going to make a traditional Hong Kong film at that time. He wanted to put his own philosophy, his own stamp onto whatever he was doing, as anyone wants to do. And so in this film, you essentially have I guess what you would call a more traditional style film that would have been made in Hong Kong. They actually shot the film in Thailand to save money, but with the participation of Lee actively fighting against that, you essentially have the first sort of new energy that he would bring much more obviously in films to come, coming into and infusing within a more traditional Hong Kong film. And of course, it's well known, and it's gone over in all the supplements, that Lee and director Lo Wei did not really get along all too well. They eventually established a sort of working relationship, and I think this creative friction between Lee and people who were already in sort of an established career in terms of their working methodology, I think the creative friction really helps the film and gives it an energy. The plot of this film and all the rest of the films, like many Hong Kong films, it's not the most complicated plot in the world. Is very simple. Essentially, Bruce Lee plays a character who is sent out to live with some relatives to work at an ice factory to start earning money for his family. And of course, the ice factory turns out to be run by a secretly corrupt drug lord who uses it as part of a drug smuggling operation. And of course, complications arise and ensue, and it builds essentially to Lee's character throwing off his inhibitions and his doubts, and that's when you get the epic fights that take place. And it does take quite some time to build up to the first time that Lee actually has a fight sequence. A lot of people criticize the film for that. It does admittedly have a slower pace, especially coming into it for the first time. You will wonder, okay, when is this really going to get going? Because the film starts more as a star vehicle for the actor James Tien, who was the original star of this film before Bruce Lee was brought in. And essentially, Tien has the lead role for the first third of the film almost, and then it transitions. Bruce's character is sort of in the background and sort of observing things, which of course makes audiences more curious about this character, and something is building and something is coming, and then Tien's character essentially passes the torch to Lee's character, and Lee's character takes over, and it's his film. But I think it's very wonderful how that anticipation is built up, anticipating when Lee is really going to come into into play, and when is the movie going to really get that massive energy upswing. And that's why I like the slow build up, now that I think about it, now that I've seen all these films in chronological release order, and really observed very closely. You can really look and see at what Lee was trying in his first time out, and then what he would do in his second feature, how he would modulate his career path, and also his acting choices, and of course the fight choreography as well. It's very well pointed out, again, gone over in the extras as well, that the fight choreography is also a bit of a mishmash. It's Lee's revolutionary ideas, but with little tinges of how fight sequences were done at the time. So it's not fully a new, revitalized type of Hong Kong action cinema like the later Bruce Lee films would become. But it's almost all the way there. It's got a little bit of holdovers, essentially, of older techniques. Like in some of the fight sequences, there are, people using trampolines to do these crazy larger-than-life jumps and things like that. But that is, it doesn't detract from the just, sort of lightning in a bottle type energy that Lee brings. And if push came to shove, this might actually be my favorite of all the Bruce Lee films, even though it is the least polished, and it is the first time out. It has that energy to it. It's also got a grittiness to the storyline, which I found actually rather refreshing. Again, the film does start out a little bit slow, especially it's really the opening third. And it obviously was shot on a rather low budget. Again, the production was in Thailand, so they didn't have all the money in the world, and they were cutting corners wherever possible. But it's that sort of ragtag type feel of people managing to pull something off against all odds that contributes even more to this energy the film has. That, again, if you can get past the sort of very drawn-out opening third of the film, I think it is very rewarding and has this charm to it, because it is the first film of its kind. And as soon as Lee appears on the screen, even before he's doing all that much, you can't take your eyes off of him. He has such a screen. He has screen presence for days. It doesn't need, even in the slightest little actions, you find your eyes drawn to him. And then, of course, you just ask yourself, well, how in the heck could nobody in Hollywood understand what this guy had? And the simple truth of it was they were scared. They're always scared of change, and they simply couldn't see it because they didn't want to. They wouldn't really give him much of a chance outside of primarily cameos, small bit parts, and attempts in television. So again, it's the sort of lightning in a bottle quality, the energy of the film, and the darker grittiness of the storyline that I really enjoyed. So don't let the opening fool you, and I really do think the build up to Lee's character finally starting to fight back is really rewarding and enhances the film experience. It makes you care about the fight sequences even more. It gets you more invested in the drama of the character arc, and you also know that the resolve is building, the resentment is building. So when he finally does explode, it will truly be explosive, and of course it is. The film was released and of course took the entire film industry by storm, breaking box office records everywhere and ensuring that in his first time out, Bruce Lee was already a screen icon. So to talk about the transfer, this was a 4K scan provided by Fortune Star, who very often, or at least most of the time, usually doesn't let studios mess with their transfers, especially when they have horrible color timing problems. And thankfully in this instance, both Shout Factory and Criterion were able to do their own color timing. So hopefully this means that that will be more of the norm going forward with these 4K transfers that have, incredible detail compared to all of the just terrible ways these films have been presented in the past, but have, shall we say, not the greatest final master in the world. And part of that I can't help but think is because these come from the dreaded L'Imagine Ritrovata group, who are behind a lot of the worst video masters ever made, including the infamous, hideous transfer that drove me crazy for years of Leone's masterpiece, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So, unfortunately, on some of these films, you will have to deal with the fact that the source scan is a Ritrovata scan. And then both Shout Factory and Criterion have gone in different ways to try and make a more aesthetically pleasing and accurate master. Which you prefer will be up to you. There are some great screen capture comparisons, and there are pages on Capsaholic that you can look at and directly compare the two. I think here on the Big Boss, the Shout Factory presentation on their remastered, retimed reissue Blu-ray, it's a bit more natural looking, whereas the Criterion is a bit cooler looking. Most of the time, you're not going to notice the difference if you're watching the Criterion disc and you don't know about any of this, but I do think that in some spots it does sort of have a little tinge of the Ritrovata look to it. I think it's a beautiful scan, and the transfer itself, in terms of the picture quality is I think probably about as good as you can possibly do with a film of this era and from Hong Kong, and a film that's been reprinted and reissued over decades and decades and decades. So I'm amazed. I'd be very curious to know what sort of shape the negatives were in, because I'm sure they had to have been printed and reprinted to absolute death. But unfortunately, you are dealing with a Ritrovata base scan. So I think it will be very dependent on how you personally look at, video mastering, which sort of look you will prefer. And it does differ on the films based on Ritrovata Fortune Star 4K scans. So there are some instances where the Criterion looks better, some instances where the Shout Factory reissue disc looks better. So it just basically becomes a matter of viewer opinion. I think it's unfortunate that this is how it is, and you have two distinct looks for what is otherwise a great new scan. But that's just how it's been done. I'm just glad that both Shout and Criterion were allowed to do their own timing work, because again, as I said before, a lot of times in the past, Fortune Star does not allow for any of that, and so we've had some great new scans of classic Hong Kong films finally get great video releases, except they're marred by terrible color timing choices. Now we jump over to the audio, where things get complicated once again. Primarily, we're all dealing with mono and stereo tracks on all the films in the Criterion release, except for the extended version of Enter the Dragon, which has a 5.1 remix Warner did back in the Laserdisc days. The Shout Factory release included a lot of 5.1 up mixes and remixes, which Criterion skipped. Personally, I think that's appropriate. These films were always mono or stereo remixes later on. There is no need to remix them into multi-channel sound. They were never multi-channel to begin with, and I really disagree with the entire practice of surround sound remixes, especially for mono films. So personally for me, I have no use for a 5.1 remix, and I'm glad Criterion didn't waste disc space by including them. However, I know some people absolutely have to have that type of audio remix, so for that you will have to hold on to or go and get the Shout Factory releases, which do include a variety of multi-channel remixes as well as the original tracks. But what Criterion includes, they include the original Mandarin mono mix. Almost all of the Lee films were originally mixed in Mandarin, even though apparently Lee himself was not fluent in Mandarin. These films were, as was the custom, shot silent with a wild guide track on set, and then the dubs would be created in post-processing, which meant they had to match the lips, and you had all the fun hijinks that you do in Italian westerns, such as the Leone westerns. So just like Italian westerns, they were films that were shot silent, and then these soundtracks had to be built up from scratch in post using only the guide reference track of the on-set audio. So that means the English dubs are quite important. A lot of people saw the English dubs, for the first time. That's how they first saw the films, and they have a great charm to them. But I myself, where possible, I always try to listen to the original audio. So the Mandarin mono is the way to go with the English subtitles. Both the Mandarin mono and the English dub are presented in a lossless PCM mono. The disc also includes some other additional dubs, which are very important because they were done at different times, but some do feature additional or actually different musical scores for this film. A lot of the Lee films do have alternate title songs as well, depending on which dub you're listening to. So it is important for historical purposes to include as many of the original dub tracks as you can. And since I'm trying to keep all track of all of this is very difficult. I had to make a lot of notes. If you see me glancing down, I'm having to glance down to remember which track is on what. There are also two other tracks that are presented in lossy Dolby Digital mono. The first is a Cantonese track, which was done at some later point for a reissue. A number of the Cantonese mixes of these films were done for later reissues. So they do have a different, it's different dub in Cantonese. It does have some differences. In some of these additional later dubs, they changed and played around with the sound effects some, and on this film, it does not have any of the iconic Bruce Lee, for lack of a better term, the yelps, the yows, the noises, the incredible noises that he would produce in the fight sequences. So in some of these remixes, they actually took some of the iconic Bruce Lee noises from later films like Fist of Fury and dubbed them in. So if you're wondering why those iconic noises aren't in the original tracks, it's because, well, they hadn't been quite developed and worked out yet. But if you listen to some of the alternate dubs, they have been pasted in there. It's interesting to look at the fight sequences with the more iconic Bruce Lee noises in them, but it is not intrinsic to the original audio design of the film. And then the last track, they include another alternate mono Mandarin dub. So again, Criterion has gone out and tried to include every original mono or stereo dub of the film and has not used any of the surround up mixes, which I think personally is the way to go. That way you include every original or close to original mix and dub of the film that would have been in a theatrical release or theatrical reissue, and you don't waste space on the disc by repeating those with revisionist up mixes. But again, if you really want those, you will have to go to the Shout Blu-ray releases. Then on to the extras for The Big Boss. It does include some vintage trailers and a TV spot. And of course varying quality. Then, as with all the Lee films, for each disc they have Matthew Polly, who wrote a biography of Bruce Lee not too long ago, basically doing a sort of it's a small interview piece, but he gives the historical context for each of the films. So these pieces are about 10 to 15 minutes each. It's a nice short little thing, but honestly, it is on some of the best of the supplemental features because it gives you the perfect background and historical context for each of the films, and then where each of their success took Bruce Lee in his career afterwards and leading into the next film. So especially even if you're a fan of the films but you don't know a whole lot about how each of the films fit in to each other in terms of the historical timeline. These are really wonderful small featurettes where he puts them exactly in the historical context of where they were made in a very nice and digestible way. So I really appreciated those. In fact, I wish they were longer because they were very on point. Then moving on, it includes what's labeled as alternate footage, which gives you a different opening credit, a slightly different ending in terms of how the edit was and how the film was shown and exhibited in some territories, and then some slightly extended scenes. The Big Boss very famously has some cuts in it and some scenes that fans have tried to find if that footage exists for years. This is the most complete version of the film included on the Criterion and Shout Blu-ray releases, but there are some additional little bits and things that have been included here, but this is culled from previous video releases. So Criterion made some of their own new extras, but then they're also pulling from Fortune Star materials and some of the things that Shout Factory did. So some of this stuff is still stuck in very old and outdated standard def transfers. It would be very much what you would be looking at on an old import DVD, for example, or a Hong Kong Legends DVD from Region 2 back in the day when you went over to the extras section and it's a little clip compilation or something that was in standard def and mastered from a print from who knows where and not very good quality. But given that's probably all that exists for this material now, or what Criterion had access to. They made a nice selection for each film in terms of what materials they would include and try and, again, cherry pick some of the best things that were the most important to give you an overall comprehensive view of the film. Then we move on to a 14-minute featurette entitled Bruce Lee, The Early Years, where martial arts instructor Jane LaBelle discusses the evolution of Lee's career. This is also where you're starting to pull more from the Shout Factory releases, because this is a Shout Extra. And these interviews they did, I really find interesting because they're very off the cuff, but it's talking directly to people who were in direct contact or worked with or who were friends of Lee. And so they're not, I enjoy it when they're not just repeating the legend and the oh, he was the great man, and they're saying the same thing that you see in all the PR releases and stuff. I really enjoy it when they talk about Bruce Lee, the person, and what he was trying to do, and that he could crack up and laugh, that he wasn't just the stoic, iconic figure that we all think of, and that most video extras will repeat the same legend status over and over and over again. So that's why I really enjoy a lot of these, especially when they were longer form little interviews that were originally compiled by Shout Factory. Then there's a video essay entitled Bruce Lee versus Peter Thomas, where Brendan Bentley discusses the creation of the soundtrack for The Big Boss by Peter Thomas. This is talking about the alternate score that's included on one of the other dubs. And this is a great little extra because it makes you think about the notion of scores done after the fact and look at its effectiveness in the film. And especially if you wouldn't already be looking at the other dub tracks, you can then go and sample that dub track and look at the score for yourself and see if you like it more than the original score for the film. And then there are two audio commentaries. The first, which was done by Brandon Bentley in 2016, and then the second by Mike Leader in 2013. Now, these seem to stem from the Shout release originally. I know the Mike Leader ones do, because they specifically say for the Shout Factory Blu-ray, and Leader did commentary, does the bulk of the commentaries in this release. The Lee films have had a number of commentaries over the years. Probably the most famous ones are the various Bay Logan commentaries. It's kind of a shame that those couldn't be included, but I'm sure there's probably licensing to do with that. But of these two, they're fine tracks. You can listen to them. I don't think either one of them is necessarily great as a commentary, but they do go over nice information, and you could listen to them while rewatching the film. The only problem is the Mike Leader commentaries. All of them have really terrible audio quality. This is something you'll notice right off the bat, and a lot of people have complained about it. The content is very solid, and he speaks in a very nice conversational style. But I think probably what happened, it seems like maybe they recorded them over Zoom because he is in Australia, and the audio does sound like when you're on a Zoom call or something. So I think they were recorded over an internet connection, and unfortunately that's just how they sound. So do be prepared if you want to sit down and listen to the commentaries. All the Mike Leader tracks sound like they were recorded online, which is unfortunate because they are pretty solid, and they are good listens, and they of the Big Boss commentaries, it is the better of the two. But it just you will have to deal with that very tinny sort of just not fun audio quality. So it is very much, again, I'm almost positive they probably recorded these. I don't know if it was Zoom or some other service, but it's like sounds like they were recorded over an internet connection. So moving on to 1972's Fist of Fury, after the runaway massive instant success of The Big Boss, a follow-up was inevitable. So Bruce Lee was reteamed with director Lo Wei, and they wound up making a historical period piece, meaning this is the only period film that Lee made based on the iconic Chinese historical hero character of Chen Zhen. It has been basically remade in a lot of different ways, but the film itself remains iconic, even though it is playing around with history in a sense. In terms of the plotline itself, it is rather simple. It is Lee playing the character of Chen Zhen, trying to discover who killed his master, and it seems rather obvious who probably did, because his entire school is being ridiculed by a Japanese contingent. So you have a nice attempt at trying to get some Chinese national pride in this story, in terms of displaying a conflict between the Chinese and Japanese factions in the film's plot. Again, it is very straightforward and builds around iconic set pieces and fight sequences that, even if you haven't seen these films, you've seen images from them that are just burned into your brain, because Lee seems so completely larger than life. And here we get even the iconic nunchaku fight. It is an incredible film in terms of growth over The Big Boss, and the fact that it's a period film, so you have to deal with period setting, costumes, sets, and it's not like they had a giant budget increase. There was a budget increase, but it's not like it was a gigantic one. So they go into a period film, and it's an incredible growth cinematically over the first film's production. You do again have this sort of clash between Lee and Lo Wei, but here it's very much swung much more over to Bruce Lee's side of the scale, and by the next film there would be none of that scale. It would be all Lee himself. So again, there is a little bit of that clash between what was then more traditional Hong Kong film style and then what Lee was trying to do. But again, here you get it much more in Lee's favor over what was in The Big Boss. So it is some people's favorite film that Lee made, and it is definitely a very handsomely mounted film, and very surprising again that they did a period piece. There's also a greater sense of romance. Lee actually has his one and only romantic scene with his female co-star, and there's also nice little glimpses of humor where it's really great to see. I don't know why you think of Lee in such a certain iconic pose that when he actually gets to be funny and crack a smile, it's like one of the best things in any of these films. So there's some nice little bits of humor as well, showing that there's more to there's additional sides and dimensions to Lee's screen persona. So Fist of Fury is incredibly important for the growth and development of Lee's style in films, and also getting more of his personal stamp into the films he was making, because obviously they weren't just going to turn him loose to start with, although they probably could have, because all this stuff was already there in The Big Boss, and that's what made it such a game changer in the Hong Kong film industry. So moving on to the picture itself, I think Fist of Fury is the best looking of the new 4K transfer scans, and on both the Criterion and Shout releases, the color timing is pretty much the same. This is the film where it pretty much seems like it was done correctly, and that you don't have the very large divergence between two different color timing approaches to a source master. It is a very surprising experience, because after seeing The Big Boss and how that looks, you don't expect there to be such a dramatic jump forward in visual composition and overall visual appearance. So I think it's an incredible looking transfer for this film and its age, its production, and again, most likely the extreme amount of wear and tear that these negatives went through. And again, I think it is a perfectly balanced color timing. It looks wonderful. And again, I think it's the most surprisingly good looking of the films. You expect the later films co-produced with Warner Brothers to look much better because they had more money and the negatives were probably here in the States, so on and so forth, having better preservation status than the earlier films. But these 4K scans really do a lot to bring out the life in the negatives that has just not been there on all the various reissue prints and all the older video versions that a lot of, especially the original Blu-rays, were primarily based, they were all upscales of old masters, as Fortune Star loves to do on their older Blu-ray releases, throughout the history of Blu-ray and even on some titles up to this day, unfortunately. So it's great that at least they're finally getting away from that and doing new scans and things, but hopefully more titles can come out of the gate with proper color timing and proper appearances like Fist of Fury as opposed to other films. Again, Criterion has stuck entirely with original mono mixes and dubs for the film, so no 5.1 up mixes. It includes the Mandarin original mono and PCM as well as the English dub and PCM. Then it includes a later Cantonese dub and lossy Dolby Digital mono. Here again, you want to go with the Mandarin mono original with English subtitles. It is the better and proper, true experience of the film, but a lot of people have great fondness for the English dub, which does have a little bit of the inherent charm of some silly dub dialogue exchanges. So I can understand why that's here and why some people would prefer that. I think it does sort of hurt the film's very stoic tone, but again, it's very iconic for people with that English dub, so it should be included on all releases, but you should be given the option to view both. And the Cantonese dub, again, seems to be from a later reissue, and it does play around with the sound effects a little bit, so it is a completely different experience, so it is right to be included as well. Now, the quality of the tracks is pretty surprisingly good on all of these. They do have some inherent damage and things, but what I noticed here on Fist of Fury is the Mandarin mono, while it sounds great on the surface, it has a pretty noticeable ground hum throughout the entirety of the film under all the dialogue and effects. And I had to double check to make sure I wasn't hearing things, but it is there. It's not particularly bad, but I'm very surprised that no one else has really talked about it because it is very obvious, particularly if you have fuller range main speakers in your home theater system or you're listening on headphones. You'll very clearly hear it on headphones. But it is a very noticeable ground hum. It's not terribly intrusive. It doesn't step over the dialogue or anything, but it is a constant presence throughout the Mandarin track. So I don't know if that's just inherent to the source or that was something they didn't remove. And to be honest, I much prefer less heavy-handed noise reduction because a lot of times in trying to remove tape hiss and things like that, very frequently most of the high end of films or a lot of the low end will get removed or attenuated, and it's really unfortunate that so many classic films do not have the greatest audio treatment. So I would much prefer having noise or ground hum or tape hiss than losing some of the frequency spectrum. But it is important to note that unfortunately there is a constant humming in the Mandarin mono that again, I'm surprised more people haven't noticed. In fact, I don't think I've heard anybody talk about it, but I had to actually stop the movie because I'm like, wait a minute, and then I kept double checking. I'm like, nope, it's there. And again, you very clearly hear it when you have headphones on. So again, that's just, I think, inherent in the source that Criterion was provided. Moving on to the extras package. Again, this is a mixture of new and pre-existing extras that Criterion licensed. So we have On Fist of Fury, which is another one of the nice Matthew Pauly pieces on the film, its background, its historical context, and that runs about 10 minutes. Then we get alternate opening credits again, first with the U.S. title, The Chinese Connection, and then the second we get the Fist of Fury Japanese opening credit version. And again, those are always really fun to look at because it's not often that films have completely different title sequences and sometimes completely different title songs that are unique to those versions. So it's very important to preserve those where possible. Then moving on, there's a archival interview entitled "The First Lady," where actress Nora Miao talks about Fists of Fury and her working relationship and friendship with Bruce Lee. It's a vintage interview. It's in Cantonese with English subtitles, but again, I really love these interviews where they're going into more personal remembrances and, again, not repeating the same anecdotes that you would hear in all the most generic stuff. So it's really cool that they were able to port over older interviews as well. Then there's another archival interview called Blade of Fury, where Riki Hashimoto talks about how he was cast in the film and his experiences during the production, and also his later experiences in making other films in Hong Kong. Then there's another archival interview called Master of Bushido, where Jun Katsumura talks about his background, experience in martial arts, and also talking about specifically Fist of Fury. That's another vintage interview as well. Then in the last of the vintage interviews, Yuan Hua talks about his work in the Hong Kong film industry and talking about Fist of Fury in particular. Again, all of these are in, obviously not in English, so they are subtitled, but they are very much worth your time. Don't be put out that they're not in English. Then we get an entire gallery of various trailers for Fist of Fury, and again, while these are actually in HD, but most of these extras, it's a hodgepodge. It's pulled from different sources, so obviously not everything is in high definition. And then lastly, everything is topped off by another Mike Leader commentary, which is a solid commentary. It's just really held back by the fact that the audio quality is quite bad. You get used to it after a while. It's not the worst thing in the world. The track is still perfectly listenable to. I listened to all the commentaries in this set, so once you hear the track for The Big Boss, you know how the others are going to sound in terms of the recording quality, but just be forewarned, it sounds like it was recorded over Zoom or something, and that's just how it is. I've heard that it was the same way on the Shout releases where these tracks originally appeared, so it's just unfortunate that these were not recorded better, but the actual track content themselves is quite solid. Again, it's not as lively as some of the older commentaries that have existed for the Bruce Lee films, but if you're interested in those, you'll have to track down other releases, and I think some have been uploaded on YouTube as well, so you might want to look around for those just to give them a listen and see what you prefer. So moving on to 1972's The Way of the Dragon, this is where Bruce Lee was given total control of the film and wound up also directing it himself. So it was his directorial debut, and it really gets rid of the notion of there being a sort of scale between the classic Hong Kong style and tradition and what Bruce Lee was trying to do with his new style of motion picture making. So it is obviously not going to be as 100% polished, shall we say, as Fist of Fury, the film that immediately preceded it, but it makes up for it in all areas in terms of energy, of risk-taking. The film was largely shot entirely on location in Rome, which was unheard of for a Hong Kong film. And it fully, obviously, it invests itself in Bruce Lee's martial arts techniques and philosophy. So the fight sequences take on new dimensions of energy and intensity, and it also allows for more of those additional flashes of humanity, especially in the humor department, that you get glimpses of that seem very much as if they're coming from Lee himself. So I think this is the film where you get the most sense of Bruce Lee's outlook on life and his own sense of humor, and you get the greatest sense of him as a person, as an artist, as a martial artist, so on and so forth. And of course, this is me just pulling stuff out of the air, but in terms of the film's tonality, I think that's the most rewarding thing, and it's wonderful. Again, you get to see him in this film most of all, making actual, humorous scenes and cracking jokes and smiling So that for me is the most rewarding part. And also, I noticed there are several different influences on these films, but here in particular, I personally felt there was a very heavy influence of Sergio Leone, not especially because it actually uses part of the Once Upon a Time in the West score and the famous Colosseum climax. It's an actual needle drop from Morricone's score, but it's also in the outlook of these films, the sort of inherent cynicism and the worldview, and also the notion of Lee's character being the sort of outsider. He's not a gunslinger, of course, but his martial arts skills can sort of take the place of that, and the way that he comes into the situation in Rome, and he's sort of the problem solver, even though the actual plot is again very simple and revolves entirely around the mob wanting to force a restaurant to close down so they can have the property. So it's kind of interesting and funny in a way, and charming that all this stuff happens out of what is seemingly the most simple thing that would have been taken care of story-wise very quickly. But again, even though it is very much Lee trying to find his feet as a director and trying to find his feet as a screenwriter and trying to bring everything that he had and get it into focus. Because it's his first time doing this, it's a little rough in places, but that none of that detracts from the film as an experience, because I think you get that sense of this is somebody really trying to put their all into something, and even if it's not as polished again as Fist of Fury, in a lot of ways it's a more enjoyable film because you feel that energy, and it builds to the iconic climactic fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris in the Colosseum that I think everybody knows worldwide, whether you've seen the film or not. So again, I think in some ways it's the most rewarding of Lee's films, because you get the greatest sense of him as a person and an artist. But again, this could be just me reading too much into all of this, but that's just my own personal takeaway. Now, talking about the actual transfer, this is another one like The Big Boss, where I think you have to look at the Criterion release and the Shout Factory release and determine which transfer you prefer, which master I should say. It's again from a 4K transfer, but this one, it's a lot more difficult to tell because for the most part the Criterion looks great, but then there are points where if you go and look at screen capture comparisons on Capsaholic where the Shout maybe looks better. So I think there's pluses and minuses to both different Blu-ray masters. On the whole, I think this is a really fine looking Blu-ray, and this film has never looked anywhere near this good before this point. But there are some places where it seems like it's having to fight against the color timing of the source master. And in those areas, the Shout Factory reissue handled it a little bit differently. So I know the fan base is very much split on these particular discs. Some people prefer one over the other. This is one where I think it's really hard to tell, but if you simply sat down with a Criterion set and you didn't have access to the Shout version and you watch this film, most people are not going to have any issues, and they're just going to be totally fine and also blown away at the level of detail that's in these 4K scans for the Lee filmography. But if you are the type of person that has a trained eye, or you like to research these things, there are two distinct different approaches to the mastering on this film as well as The Big Boss, comparing the Criterion versus the Shout reissue Blu-rays with the color timing adjustments. And again, it is the same 4K master as a base underneath, so this all goes back to that master was done a certain way, and then you have two different labels trying their hand at making a more accurate or corrected version of that source master. So it's just going to be individual opinions which you prefer. But if you're curious about this type of stuff, I encourage you to do some research or go to Capsaholic and look at the screen capture differences between the two different releases in order to see if there's maybe one you prefer or if you'll be fine just sticking with the Criterion release. Again, Criterion has given us multiple audio selections, with the lossless tracks being the default ones. We have the original Mandarin mono in PCM, as well as the English dub in PCM mono. Also presented are two additional foreign alternate tracks. There is a later Cantonese dub, and again, all the Cantonese mixes seem to either be from slightly later theatrical exhibitions or reissues done later, and they did do some different effects here and there if you want to listen to those. And then there's also an additional English dub, which apparently was created for a Japanese release. So it is a second English track, but it is different in places to the official main English dub. So if you're wondering why there's two different English dubs, that's why. Again, the four alternate dubs are in lossy Dolby Digital, and we're not obviously given the same royal treatment and level of cleanup and that the main tracks were. Again, I highly recommend everybody just go in and listen to the original Mandarin mono and watch the film with English subtitles engaged. But once again, a lot of people really do enjoy the inherent fun and goofiness of the English dub, so that's perfectly, wonderful for people who prefer the dub, and that's why it should always be included on releases. But again, I myself, whenever possible, try to always view the film with the original audio. Moving on to the extras package, we again have a Matthew Polly piece on the film entitled On the Way of the Dragon, which again gives you great background and perfect historical context for the film and its release. Then we move on to an older 2001 documentary, which I guess was created for an older video release in terms of extras, entitled Legacy of the Dragon. And this is one of those, 45-minute, some odd long documentaries where you get the various talking head interviews of various people who knew and worked with Lee. And it's a pretty decent little documentary, but it doesn't really get into the meat of a lot of things, and you'll hear a lot of the main anecdotes that you would know or hear if you watch a lot of the standard extras. But it's cool that they included it. It's an okay one. When you're looking at documentaries of this type, where it's the talking heads interviews, and it has more meat on the bones than most of those will. But do keep in mind, it is what it is. It is a product of its time, so it is an older interview-based mini documentary on Lee's career. Then we also get two different alternate opening credit presentations, which are mostly the same, but they are different in terms of the text placement and the actual design of the title sequence itself. So that's a really cool inclusion. Then we get another archival older documentary piece called Bruce Lee Remembered, which is a whole bunch of the big names in Hong Kong cinema talking about Lee's career. It's a short little 8-minute piece. Then there's another of the interviews conducted by Shout Factory originally, called, of course, Kung Fu? I say it that way because that's the famous villain line from the film. So they were able to interview actor John Ben, and he talks about how he was found and cast in the film and how he sort of turned it into a whole career in Hong Kong and how he's still recognized on the streets to this day. So it's a nice longer 20-some-odd minute piece that, again, is one of the nice interviews that Shout Factory was able to record and compile. Then under the heading of promotional materials, Criterion includes a trailer gallery with some vintage trailers of the film, and then, in a really cool touch, they were able to find an original radio spot, and I love radio spots to death, so anytime those can be included, I get really happy. Then, to top everything off, there's another Mike Leader commentary. Once again, it's a really solid track with nice information, but it is marred by the terrible recording quality. So keep in mind when you try to listen to it, if you can get over how it sounds, it is a nice, solid track. So that's just, again, it's unfortunate that happened, but that's just how it is with these particular commentary tracks. After the release and runaway success, again, of Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee famously started his next film, which was to have been Game of Death. He shot about 40 minutes of usable footage for the main action of the film and was essentially forced to shelve it in order to go and make what would become his next film, and unfortunately his last theatrically released feature, actually released after his death. That was 1973's Enter the Dragon, which was the American co-production with Warner Brothers, meaning a significantly higher budget, but meaning also an American director, American money, American studio involvement. So this was really such a gigantic opportunity for Lee and the Hong Kong film industry that it was the film that was going to bridge the gap between the two worlds, as it were, and a lot of things were on the line for this film. Enter the Dragon is the most famous and well-known and well-loved of Lee's films, primarily because of its greater distribution here in the States, and of course Warner has marketed the heck out of it with multiple video releases and the special edition cut, so on and so forth. As a film, it has, again, a very simple plot where Lee's character is recruited to infiltrate an island fortress where a martial arts tournament is being held in order to confront and discover what the lead villain of the piece is up to, and because he is suspected of many, many different crimes. And complications arise from there. The joy of these films is in the journey of the plot. It's not in the fact of the resolution being full of grandeur and things like that. So films like this, when you come to them for the first time, if you're used to more traditional Hollywood action films, they could perhaps leave you a little bit wanting in terms of the actual narrative content. And also, this film is honestly in a lot of ways much more Americanized. It's still Bruce Lee with heavy involvement, but he also changes his fighting styles, and this is much more about tournament fighting instead of the street fighting that you would see in the earlier films. I also think you get less of his personal stamp and feeling. Again, he's still fully involved, but I think you can tell a distinct difference in tone and energy comparing the first three films in this set, and then you get to Enter the Dragon, and it is a tonal shift because it is Warner Brothers producing, and it is a different director this time in the form of Robert Clouse, who did not get along with Lee all that much. So there was, again, that creative friction going on, but again, it's an iconic film. There's not a whole lot you can say about it that people don't already know, and it is the easiest access point to first look at Bruce Lee's filmography. I know it was the first Lee film that I saw, and again, before getting this set and digging into everything, it was the only one I had seen in its entirety, because I had been waiting to see these films on Blu-ray anyway, and hoping they would get restored so I could not have to worry about trying to find the correct video versions with the correct audio tracks and transfers and complete versions, so on and so forth. So that's why these Blu-ray releases from both Criterion and Shout Factory are such godsends for people like myself who try to see films as they were intended. But again, practically every image, every moment of this film is iconic in its own way, from the tournament fight sequences to the opening, which actually gets in some of Lee's philosophy and a nice little humorous bit, and the iconic mirror fight at the end of the film. And probably most of all for me, the thing that never leaves you is Lalo Schifrin's amazing score for the film, which is itself hugely iconic and essentially got him the job scoring the Rush Hour films decades later. So Enter the Dragon has had many different video releases from Warner Brothers, but unfortunately, not all of them have been very great. And while they did do a Blu-ray reissue, it was still working off of various elements, and it was still the extended cut of the film, and it didn't have the film's original mono mix. So it was a real mixed bag, and also dropped some of the original extras from the older releases. So the release and the Criterion version is honestly, I think, the biggest draw to this box set, because on this main disc, you're getting the original theatrical version, which has not been released on video since the early 1990s Laserdisc release. It was supplanted by the extended cut, which is about 3 minutes longer. The theatrical cut's 99 minutes. The extended cut's 102 minutes. The differences are minor. It's basically one additional scene and a little bit of extra bit in one or two other places. But they also did a 5.1 remix for the extended cut, which then became sort of the new de facto standard for the film and is nowhere near as good as the original mono mix. It has some new effects, it spreads things around, and honestly, I find it distracting. So that's another reason why I never really enjoyed watching Enter the Dragon, because it had sort of been messed around with, and I hate surround remixes when they're unnecessary. The 5.1 on Enter the Dragon is fine. It doesn't, it's not hugely revisionist, but it's still revisionist. So I had always hoped the film would get its mono mix restored, as well as maybe having the theatrical cut as well. So it was a total shock that this was included here. It's a brand new 2K scan done by Warner MPI, and had Criterion not released it this way, this would have been you could imagine this being a Warner Archive Blu-ray, because for all I can tell, this was made exactly in the same way that Warner Archive Blu-rays are prepared. A new 2K or 4K scan is done by MPI in-house, and then Warner Archive releases it on Blu-ray with a maxed out bitrate. This has a nice bitrate as well, and it looks really wonderful. And it restores the original mono mix, which is presented in lossless quality. It's also got a little bit of noise and hiss here and there, so it doesn't seem to have been hit with Agraria's noise reduction, which is a great sign. This is the best time I've had watching Enter the Dragon ever, and I was so pleased that it had a brand new scan and didn't have any of the issues with some of the earlier films, because this was done at Warner MPI, brand new scan from their vault elements, and restores the original mono mix. The theatrical cut is included on this disc by itself. Criterion does include the extended version, but under the supplemental package, so there's actually two different versions of the film on two different discs. So the Enter the Dragon disc is specifically the theatrical cut in this new scan. The extended version is the same new scan, but with the additional footage, and they also had the 5.1 mix as an extra. If I had to choose one audio track as the best in the set, it would be the Enter the Dragon mono. Again, I don't have the old Laserdisc to compare. It's one I've always wanted to check out, because that was the only way to hear the mono mix before this point. But I can only assume this was a new transfer, and it sounds better than I thought it would be. Again, it has a nice punchiness to it. It has dynamics, and even though you will get little bits of hiss here and there, and there's maybe a tick or two, there's a little bit of tiny flashes of noise here and there. Again, I don't mind that when they're not messing around with the audio source track itself. So I really need to find that Laserdisc so I can do a direct comparison one of these days, but I was very pleasantly surprised by this. So I think the presentation and the new scan, and including the mono mix of Enter the Dragon, is really worth the entire purchase of the Criterion set. You get all the other films, you get new extras as well. It's a nice, concise package, but I do think the new disc for Enter the Dragon is enough to warrant looking at picking up the Criterion set. Moving on to the extras, it includes promotional materials, which is an old electronic press kit, which is wonderful to see. It includes a trailer gallery, original TV spots, and a radio spot as well. Some of this did appear on the various Warner Brothers releases. Then we get another new Matthew Polly piece talking about the film, its importance in Lee's career, its importance being the film to bridge the gap between Hong Kong cinema and Hollywood, and of course, how the production went, and what Lee sort of had to change, and how he had to adapt himself into this American financed production. Then we get another older documentary piece entitled Blood and Steel, which is specifically about Enter the Dragon. Again, this was included on the older Warner Brothers releases. Then there's another older documentary entitled Bruce Lee in His Own Words. It was produced by John Little, again, from some of the older Warner releases. That's a nice little documentary. Then there's a small interview, about 20 minutes, with Lee's widow, Linda Lee Caldwell, which is always great to hear from the friends and family talking directly about the person who is no longer with us. Then there's a small interview with Tong Wai talking about first meeting Bruce Lee, and then so that's a nice, fun little tiny interview. And that's it for this particular disc. The one thing I do think is an oversight, they do leave out what was on the older Warner releases, which is the documentary Bruce Lee: A Warrior's Journey, which also includes the original Game of Death footage that Lee shot, and in a more put together form that's very much untouched. So you can see everything he shot just cut together without any tinkering. I know why they did this. It's because they included another newer version of that footage, but I do think it would have been it was important to include that documentary, which is itself really excellent. It was included on the old releases of Enter the Dragon, and they dropped it for the last Warner Blu-ray. So I wish that was included on here, because I do think it's the one really big missing piece of the supplemental features. But thankfully, it is online. You can watch that documentary on some streaming services, so it is floating out there. And of course, if you have the old Enter the Dragon DVDs and Blu-rays, it's on there as well. When Bruce Lee passed away before the release of Enter the Dragon, that meant that he left behind the 40 minutes or so of unused footage for Game of Death, the film that was never to be. So the footage was shelved for a number of years until finally in 1978 we got the film Game of Death. Again, with Golden Harvest working somewhat in tandem with Warner Brothers, and also, again, directed by Robert Klaus. Game of Death is a hard film to discuss because some people find it absolutely reprehensible. Some people find it charming in a sort of goofy, weird way. Because what Golden Harvest did was take the footage that Lee had shot and basically stuck it onto the end of a completely new story, which itself was a film that would normally be considered the genre that Lee had unintentionally inspired, known as Bruceploitation. All of the various films and terrible knockoffs that came out after, well, really as soon as The Big Boss came out, but really took off after Lee's death. There are bits of that covered in the extras of this Criterion release, but it's important to note that, Game of Death itself is sort of the greatest of the Bruceploitation movement. As a film, again, it's very hard to discuss because the quality is very scattershot, and there were much more sensitive and honorable ways to use the footage, whether it be, simply presented as it was, and then the rest be a documentary about Bruce Lee's life, and then maybe release that in theaters, and it'd be about 80 or 90 minutes as a sort of tribute and way for fans to finally get to see this legendary footage. I also understand why that wouldn't be considered feasible and why you'd want to turn it into a story and a new narrative. I guess it makes sense having it at the end of the film and building up to it, but it would have been much easier had you maybe started with that footage and somehow made a bridge to the rest of the story and the new footage. But all of that would have required a lot of thought and care and attention to detail and sensibility. I really don't think a lot of that went into the into the crafting of how this story setup was. So coming into Game of Death for the first time is a very bizarre experience. The film kind of goes all over the place and uses the iconography of some of these other films as jumping off points, and itself is a Bruceploitation film because you have a character playing Bruce Lee who obviously isn't Bruce Lee, and there's even in the opening there are some really terrible instances, particularly one shot where they literally use a cutout of Lee's face pasted over the point where the stand-in is. So and the plot itself does not make really a lick of sense when you look at it, so you start to just nod along and go with its quirky weirdness, and in a strange way it starts to sort of work, and you don't hate it by the end of it. There is some good material there are some good ideas there, and it seems that friends and former co-workers of of Lee who were involved in the film did try to put as much effort as they could into making those sequences and moments as good as possible, particularly a lot of the fight sequences. But it was held back by the fact that it was an ill-conceived proposition to start with. The usage of footage from Lee's previous films is so completely blatant that it's really insulting. um, and to be quite honest, the saving grace of the film, the one, well, I should say, one of the two great things in the film is John Barry's score. Being a gigantic John Barry nerd, I will admit I've actually heard his score long before I actually saw the film, and I love everything he ever did. So I am, of course, biased in that sense. And I think this film is a fantastic example of Barry's innate talent to be able to score the living heck out of anything and make it move and give it energy and emotion. So the score is phenomenal, and just as good as Schifrin's score for Enter the Dragon. It is, those are the two majestic scores you will be treated to when you look at Lee's filmography. And not to say that the scores for the previous films are bad, but in these two films you have legendary composers doing fantastic work. So the one of the two saving graces of Game of Death is without question John Barry's score for the film, and the other, of course, is finally getting to at least a portion of the 40 minutes of footage that Lee shot and completed for the original Game of Death. And if you needed any reminder, you're sitting through the entirety of Game of Death and you're just going through the motions and you're just like, what the heck is going on? And it's just all over the place. You chuckle a little bit, you wince in uncomfortability at other points, and then you get to the point where the film changes over to that original footage and Lee himself just walks into the room and you get that close up, and it's like everything was worth it to get to that point. So even though it's very little of that footage and it is intercut with the new material, and then it goes into a little tag ending that is unsatisfying of new footage, it is worth it, and it would have been worth it back in 78 to sit through the entirety of the film just to get finally some of that imagery and that experience. So that's what you sit through the whole film for. It's a tough film to talk about. It's a tough film to discuss and analyze, and I mean, it's fascinating in ways to try and understand what they were thinking and what they were doing. I think the absolute worst part, though, and they were not the only ones who used footage of this, but the worst part and the most insensitive part is when the character in the film, the Lee character, apparently dies. There is a staged death. They actually use and show footage of Lee's actual funeral in Hong Kong, which is probably, I would say, the absolute definition of the word tasteless and insensitive. You also see that in other films and documentaries as well. So it's not like they were the only ones who did that, but that is one of those points where you get just completely divorced from a film experience and you're totally taken out of it because it's just, yeah. So if you've never seen Game of Death, do keep that in mind, because that's another thing. So the film itself is quite bonkers. It's not the most bonkers film in this set, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it is a strange beast. Let's put it that way. So of course we are dealing with another 4K scan of original material provided by Fortune Star. Game of Death itself does not have as much of the variances between it and the Shout Factory release, comparing the Criterion and the Shout Factory release. I do think there are some portions of the transfer that are quite a bit dark, but also that could be part of the source itself. Again, there's not really any information about what shape these films were in, but it does seem like the best presentation the film has ever gotten on video, and there is a fine amount of detail in the scan, but it itself, because the film is such a weird thing and it's a mixture of footage, the quality is not always there because there are frequent cutaways to duped in footage from previous films. The film includes two different tracks, both of them in English this time. So we have the original English mono mix from the theatrical release, which sounds good for what it is. And then there's an alternate English track, which apparently is from a Japanese release version of the film. I did sample it and sort of check it out. It didn't seem really much different at all to the main English track, but again, I didn't watch the entirety of the film with both. I'm sure there are some differences. There's probably some different dialogue as well. Moving on to the extras, we get another Matthew Polly piece about the film and its place in Lee's filmography called On Game of Death. Then there are vintage trailers included. Under alternate footage, we get alternate opening credits, alternate endings, which is, unfortunately, they're all mostly the same. There were slightly different ways the film ends, and unfortunately, all of them are rather abrupt, which really leaves a bad taste in the mouth after sitting through the entirety of what you've just watched. But it's great that at least all the existing endings are here, although they are all in not very good quality at all. Then there are 4 deleted scenes that were removed from the film. Some, like, there's a particular fight in the greenhouse that was removed, and I don't understand why. It's one of the more intensive fight sequences. It's a little goofy, but and apparently this was left in some territories. So we are getting the primarily worldwide international version of the film, because there are apparently longer edits of the film as well. But that scene also appears in the next film we'll discuss, which is the quasi-sequel to this film. So those are included, as well as some outtakes and bloopers as well. And it seems all of these were culled from older video extras, and the quality varies, but those are fascinating to see, of course, especially since they survived in some fashion. Then one of the best extras, this is another that Shout originally did. They interviewed Bob Wall, who was a friend of Lee's and appeared in, as far as I know, more Lee films than any other actor. And of course, he is a total character and beyond entertaining to listen to, and very much speaking in an off-the-cuff manner, and it's a nice 30-minute piece. And again, I think it's probably the best of all the interview pieces and extras, so I'm glad that was able to be included from the original Shout releases. We get another Mike Leader commentary, which itself is pretty solid, and if you're interested in knowing more about the film, I do recommend listening to it. But again, you got to deal with the really terrible audio quality. So again, unfortunately, that just seems baked in to the commentary track. Now, the big extra, and the one I alluded to before when talking about Enter the Dragon, is Game of Death Redux. This is a brand new re-edit of Lee's original 40 minutes of footage done in 2020, and apparently was so well received that Criterion decided they wanted to include it in their release. This takes all of that footage and also essentially also does a new sound mix and tries to incorporate some of John Barry's Game of Death score as well, which of course was not composed for the original film because the original film was never finished. So this really is more, it's technically a fan edit is what it is. It's rather impressive for what it is, but I do think it's not as good of a presentation of the original intent of the footage as we got in the older documentary, A Warrior's Journey. So that's why I wish they had included that documentary so people could see the footage as is. This is still a great way to see it. It's an interesting attempt, and unfortunately it seems this footage has never been scanned in HD because it looks like it's the same sort of source and standard def material that they worked from on this re-edit as the original documentary had. So it's not like this is a new HD scan of that footage. I hope that footage has been preserved. It was thought lost for many decades. I hope that footage has been preserved, and it should have been scanned in HD. I wish it was included here in HD, but I don't know the status of that legendary footage that exists of Game of Death. But this is how you can see it on the Criterion release. At least it is here in some fashion, and it is an interesting attempt at giving it new life and making it play a bit better for modern audiences. But again, I do wish the original presentation that you see in the older documentary was included as well. So for me, that's the major oversight in the extras package. I think both iterations should have been included. So we move on to what is Disc 6 and is entitled A Supplemental Disc, but this is actually including an additional feature. This was not a Bruce Lee film, but is so closely tied to it and is one of the key films of what is known as the Bruceploitation movement that it's a really cool addition, even though the film itself, I mean, I can't quite call it terrible. The best word to describe it is bonkers. That is, of course, 1981's Game of Death 2, which is it's a sort of sequel to the 1978 Game of Death film. This was made entirely without the team of Game of Death. This was a Golden Harvest film. It is a mixture of different styles. It is all over the place. You can't really believe what you're seeing, but I do encourage people to check it out because I think by watching Game of Death and then this film Game of Death 2, it gives you a great overview of just how crazy the Bruceploitation effect was of this genre that sprung up after the success of Lee and then his untimely death. So, and also, this film apparently has a number of different edits, and we're seeing a English language version. So there's only one audio track included, which is an English mono, and there is some smatterings of other dialogue, but it's all terrible, goofy English dubbed in. And again, the film is just something you have to see. And there are points where you sort of laugh uncontrollably because of just the inherent insanity of what you're seeing. It doesn't make a lick of sense. It's all over the place. It's got wild stuff like a guy eating raw meat for breakfast, some crazy murder sequences, a helicopter landing to steal a casket at a funeral. These are just some of the random elements you will see in Game of Death 2. And the finale takes place in a secret complex where there seems to be a room filled with guys and surrounded by a red moat, which may be full of blood. I don't know. In a sort of insane way, I kind of wish it was a river of blood because that would just be the wild sort of insanity you find in this film. It is terrible. It is. But it is so wild and all over the place that it makes a fantastic supplemental feature, but it is not good. It is not good at all. And it's not helped by the really goofy English dub, but the goofy English dub sort of helps you get through a lot of things. That being said, I wish it did have an original dub track that was maybe able to get across some more of the original feeling of this film. I don't know, but I don't know if it would play better in Mandarin or Cantonese, but I wish that had been an option. This is also an up conversion. It's not an HD master, that's a native HD master. So this is essentially an as-is bonus presentation of a film that is very much evidence of what Bruce Lee's legacy became, unfortunately, for a long, long time. And the fact that it's linked to the 1978 Game of Death, that's why it's important to watch it after seeing Game of Death. So I am very grateful it was included here. It's not going to be covered in most things, and it's sort of a sequel in name and in only certain ways, but it does its own thing, and then it reuses some deleted scenes from the 1978 Game of Death. So you get really confused really fast. Let's just put it that way. And again, it is terrible. So the enjoyment factor is just from the sheer insanity. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to question it. It is what it is. It is Game of Death 2. Again, the picture quality is this is an up conversion from standard def materials, and the film itself, picture-wise, is so inconsistent, as is everything else. Of course, the picture is going to be inconsistent, and the usage of clips of other earlier Bruce Lee films and clips of Game of Death means that the quality is all over the place. But that being said, it was a surprisingly decent experience. I don't intend on probably ever watching this film again, but for what it was, seeing it the one time, it was surprisingly decent. And I guess if you feel like spinning through it again, then well, it's there. Of course, would have been great to have it as native HD, but it is what it is, and I don't think I'm going to be splitting hairs too much about Game of Death 2. Again, there's only an English mono dub track. It is lossy Dolby Digital, so you're not getting any HD audio, but since the film itself is not the greatest and not the greatest quality, the audio itself sort of fits, and again, the English dub and all its insanity and goofiness does help make the movie go more quickly. I guess it's a less painful experience because it's so wacky. Then moving on to the extras included on this disc, we get original trailers for Game of Death 2, because you got to hype up this film that otherwise nobody else wanted anything to do with. Then there's an alternate opening, which is apparently sourced from a VHS tape, and it is a very low quality. Then there's the real draw of this disc is the inclusion of the vintage 1973 documentary about Bruce Lee, made really right after his death. That is entitled Bruce Lee, the Man and the Legend. Again, this is a feature-length documentary with tons of original footage and footage of even the Lee home in Hong Kong and Lee's study. And once again, you see extensive footage of his funeral, although it makes actual sense being in a documentary about the man's life as opposed to being just terribly shoved into films trying to exploit him after his death. But it is a little hard to get through because there is extensive footage of, again, not only his funeral and his casket, but also his grieving widow and his children, and then actually seeing his house and seeing his study where he worked and where he trained in his gym. And it's just like literally walking through a dead man's home. It's such a strange experience. It is very much, they actually went there and they actually shot this footage, and it seems like, I guess it was maybe 16 millimeter, and it has been transferred in HD, so it is an experience, and it does look pretty nice. But you start watching it, and it's very morbid. I'll put it that way. I had seen clips of this before, but I'd never seen the whole thing, and not in HD either. So it is a very morbid experience for those who have not seen it before. But it is great that it was included, and we also get a trailer for the documentary as well. So that's really the main draw of this, but the disc is also shared with the SD upconvert of Game of Death 2. Then moving on to disc 7, also called Supplemental Features. This is actually where you get to see the extended cut of Enter the Dragon. So this is the 102-minute version, the special edition cut, as most people like to call it. And it does have the special edition 5.1 mix. However, this is the same base Warner MPI 2K scan and transfer as you see on the theatrical cut disc. And it also includes the original mono mix, which is really important for another reason as well, because in the additional footage that you have in this special edition cut, in the 5.1 mix, they redubbed it because they were making a new mix, and the original audio apparently didn't suffice for them. So they actually had to get a voice actor to dub Bruce Lee in that one major scene that's included in the special edition cut. Whereas in the mono, it's the same mono that you get in the theatrical cut for the rest of the feature. But in that one scene, it is the original mono of that sequence, that scene. And it is Bruce Lee actually doing the dialogue. So it is something that, as far as I know, has not been on any major home video release before this point. So this is actually Bruce Lee doing his own voice in that one scene. So when you're watching the long cut of the film, you can finally experience it with its original mono mix, and you get that one additional scene, but with actual Bruce Lee's actual voice as opposed to the voice actor. And when you compare the two, because you can toggle back and forth between the mono and the 5.1, it becomes very clear now that there was a voice actor who did the redubbing, and he does a very good job. But it's very noticeable, and it's amazing that you can now hear Bruce Lee's original dialogue recording for that. Unfortunately, it's just that one scene, but that's why the mono track is really important on this disc. So it is a nice little scene. I don't really think it makes all too much of a difference between the theatrical cut and the longer cut. My problem was always more with the 5.1 remix the film got stuck with. So this is an exceptional way to watch the film. It's the same great new transfer and restoration from Warner MPI, and you get the bonus of that additional scene actually featuring Bruce Lee's original voice recordings this time around in the mono mix. So again, If that doesn't entice Bruce Lee fans, I don't know what will. But I do think the entire Criterion set is worth it just for the presentation quality of this new Enter the Dragon restoration and presentation from this 2K Warner MPI master. So again, I think it's worth it just for Enter the Dragon alone. So essentially, picture-wise, it's the same as the theatrical cut disc. It's the same base master. The only difference is the specific footage for the extended cut and the fact that you're getting a lossless presentation of the 5.1 remix as well. So that way people who love that remix can enjoy the film in its new presentation, but still get the extended cut and the 5.1 remix that was done originally all the way back in the late 1990s for the Warner Brothers Special Edition Laserdisc release. Moving on to the extras, we have a really great interview called Risk and Reward. It's with producer Andre Morgan. He's talking about working for Golden Harvest and working with Bruce Lee, and how, especially how Lee was trying to always develop his image, and then how he was trying to develop his image in America after he had finally started having success in Hong Kong, and getting into what the success of Enter the Dragon would mean, not just for Golden Harvest as a company, for Bruce Lee, but also for the Hong Kong film industry. So the how you really get the sense of how much that Lee cared about Enter the Dragon being not just successful, but promoting all the ideals that he held and all the ideas that he was working so hard for in the films he had already made. So this would be his breakthrough into America to not only become a great star in Hollywood, but to also bring all of these new ideas that he had been honing in the previous films to Hollywood, because before they wouldn't even let him in the back door and they wouldn't give him the time of day. Then we get a whole featurette on the Bruceploitation movement, of course, called Bruceploitation. So this gives you all the background on all of the knockoffs and imitators that sprung up as soon as the Big Boss came out and went into overdrive after Lee's death, and are just incredibly, unbelievably total ripoffs, right down to the fact that they're mostly starring actors under the name of Bruce Lee and Bruce Lai, and just with slight changes to the spelling, and so many copyright infringements you couldn't possibly sue for all of them because there were so many. They also include Bruceploitation promos, which are some trailers and little samples of some of these just unbelievable ripoffs that were produced. Then we get a lovely featurette called Match My Lips, which is probably the best of the new extras that Criterion put together. So this is going to some of the original voiced dub artists and talent behind the English language dubs and some of the other dubs, and they give you a very much fly-on-the-wall presentation of how these dubs were put together and written and recorded back in the day, and how sometimes Bruce Lee himself would become involved and want to do certain things. I'd have to explain to him that you have to do it this way in a dubbing session, and it's not always the way that you act it out and things like that. So there's some really funny, humorous anecdotes, and it's just fascinating because it's something that just never gets covered in any sort of detail, and people just like to laugh at how goofy some of the dubs are, but they themselves were not easy to do and were often rushed, and they didn't have a lot of money, didn't have a lot of time, and they didn't always have proper translations of the dialogue, and they had to do a lot of work themselves with only a few people having to do multitudes of different voices. So it's a fascinating piece, and I think the best of the new extras that Criterion created for this set. Then we get a older documentary called The Grandmaster and the Dragon, which is about the Grandmaster of Wing Chun martial arts, and how he first encountered Bruce Lee and trained him, and their relationship over the rest of Lee's life. And it's a pretty substantial, it's about an hour long, so it's a really actually surprisingly rewarding little, well, not little, but almost feature-length documentary interview piece. And then lastly, we get the original producer commentary from the Warner Brothers releases. It's it's a little sparse in terms of the commentary, but there are some nice anecdotes. It's one of those commentary tracks that you listen to just because it's, somebody who was there. It's not the liveliest commentary track in the world, but it is rewarding enough for fans of the films and fans of Bruce Lee that it's just one of those nice pieces that a lot of the listenability of the track is made up for by the fact that this was somebody who was really there on the set every day and has that firsthand account experience. So let's move on to the disc packaging itself. So take down the box here. This is done in a similar design to what Criterion has done before in some of their other box sets. Again, this is spine 1036, and we have this wraparound art design that carries throughout the entirety of the package. And to be honest, I really love what they did, and the yellow of the box itself mimics very much the iconic yellow tracksuit from the Game of Death footage, and the art goes on to the actual fold-out. The rear is yellow in the traditional Criterion design, giving you this special features breakdown, and it's a nice slim box that still fits on the shelf nicely. And of course, the boldness of the yellow makes it stand out on the shelf as well. So we get to the fold out, and we get these varying poses of Bruce across the fold out design. And so when you fold everything out, you get really nice wraparound effect that I do really enjoy. Then the discs themselves have a nice matching uniform design as well, all keeping with the same yellow, black, and white motif, each with one of the custom images of Bruce Lee that's on the Digipack fold-out on each representative disc. So you have the 5 primary feature discs, and then the 2 discs credited as supplements, which of course have additional features, and Game of Death 2, and the extended cut of Enter the Dragon as well. Now, I'm not exactly sure what you would call this motif underneath the disc, but it's a sort of rippling effect, which it took me a long while to realize. I guess it's maybe supposed to be water, after the iconic Bruce Lee water quote, "Be water, my friend." But again, I'm not exactly sure. That's just a guess on my part. Now, I will say in terms of the Digipack fold out, this is something I've seen Criterion do before. This is not necessarily, this is more on nitpicking criticism, but it is something that you will notice. So when you're holding this, it is a little bit on the flimsy side, unfortunately. It's not completely flimsy, but there is a little bit of flimsiness to it. So if you're getting this out a lot of times, and you just, as soon as you fold open the first fold, it's hard to describe this visually, but it does have a slight bit of wobble to it. So it's not really super thick and sturdy. You can also notice there's a little bit of give when you have it closed like this. That will naturally happen with Digipack releases, but it seems whatever Criterion uses in terms of their the materials, it's still sturdy enough, but it's always that flimsier feel to it. Another thing that is a little bit, again, it's not quite fully frustrating, but if you're getting discs in and out, you will notice that the actual disc hubs, even though it's on a stacked tray type design, the top disc is fine to get out, but the bottom disc is a little bit on the tougher side to get in and out. They have the little slots that they sit underneath the top disc, but it's a little finicky in terms of this particular type of design. Again, nothing bad. It's perfectly fine. We're all used to this type of design by now, but I've had a number of sets like this where it's a little bit more finicky getting the discs in and out in terms of that's just the particular case layout for the actual disc hubs. But at the very least, the discs are properly protected and in an actual case, unlike the fancier Criterion box sets where they went more for the artiness of the design, like the essential Fellini set or the big Ingmar Bergman set, where the discs are in those awful slot sleeve page things. So even if it's a little bit finicky of a digipack case and the hubs are a little finicky, that is perfectly fine compared to what it could be. But it's just something I wanted to note because I was handling this thing a lot and looking at the different features and watching the films one at a time. So if you get this on and off the shelf a lot and you're just always flipping through it, you will have to be careful because it is a little bit on the thinner side. Now, there is no traditional booklet in the usual mold. What Criterion has gone for instead is what at first seems like a booklet, but is actually printed like an old magazine. So you get this very stylized, wonderful, fun, different version of the booklet. You still get a really nice Criterion style essay as usual, but it's done in this different style. So it is a stapled book, just like an old magazine. So it is, of course, folded, and you will have to turn the pages very, very carefully. It's a cute idea. And I get why they went for it, but I still myself would have preferred just a straight booklet. However, again, I understand why they did this. The one problem is, while you get great images and it's a great throwback to the 1970s, there is no specific listing and breakdown of the disc contents. All you have is the listing of the extras on the back, and that's really it, unless you're popping in the disc yourself. So if you're having a hard time remembering what feature is on what disc, you have to memorize it or look it up online. That's why I was having to look at my notes more than usual, because usually I can just glance down, if it's just, one or two discs. But they did do, as advertised on the front of this, it's a full color poster. So the idea of this being just like an old magazine where there would be the poster that you could tear out. And of course, me being one of those people that, even when I was growing up, I would look at magazines and see the poster, and I couldn't bear to actually tear it out. So then you get to the actual essay portion, which again is designed just like the old feature article in a movie magazine, giving you background on Bruce Lee and the films, his career trajectory, his impact and legacy. So it's a great essay as usual, but of course you will have to deal with the fact that the book is itself designed and folded like a magazine. So you do have to be very careful, and it does want to continually flop down. Then the last page gives the game away by being the acknowledgments and credit page. This is where you find out about the transfers. You'll see Ritrovata get name dropped, and it talks about the 4K scans done by Ritrovata with Fortune Star. And then this will tell you, about which films were that, and then talks about Warner Brothers MPI doing the 2K scan on Enter the Dragon, which films they also had to work from interpositives instead of negatives, and then the credits as well. Interestingly, as I was saying, the mono track for Enter the Dragon sounds so amazingly good, and I'd forgotten that here in the credits it actually talks about it was mastered from the original magnetic stems, the dialogue, music, and effects magnetic stems. So as I alluded to, that's why it sounds so good. And so this is your credits page, but again, there is no breakdown of the discs themselves. And then rather cheekily, there is an ad for Become a Master in the Ancient Art of Kung Fu, just like the old ads you would see at the back of movie magazines or comic books at this time. So that's a really cheeky and wonderful little way to close out this magazine booklet. And here's another poster type shot of Bruce there. And then this just folds up, and the way you have to work it in this casing, it doesn't slot inside the box. It's too thick for that. So you have to actually open this, and you have to figure out where you're going to slot the book inside. So I just kept it the way it was when I got it. So if you open the first disc panel, this just literally sits right inside there, and then you close the first panel on it. So then it's just kept securely in there, and then the set is a little tiny bit thicker because the book is in there. It keeps it secure, and then you just put it back inside the slipcase box. Enter the Dragon theme plays while I try to get this box back in the slipcase. So that is Criterion's package of Bruce Lee's filmography entitled his greatest hits. And as I said before, I think this is now the de facto standard best go-to complete package for Lee's filmography. I think this gives you everything you necessarily need, although it is not perfectly complete for the diehard fans and completists. If you want more or you want additional features, you'll have to go to the out-of-print Shout Factory Blu-ray releases. Also, due to the color timing differences on the Ritrovata mastered titles, some people may prefer the Shout Factory Blu-ray presentations of those particular films. So that's another reason why you might prefer that. But outside of that, I think Criterion chose really and cherry picked the best of the pre-existing extras for the most part, and you get a great selection of what has come before, plus some really nice new extras. For fans who have already purchased or own the Shout Factory Blu-rays, the real question is going to be, how much do the new extras bring to the table, and are you really interested in the new presentation of Enter the Dragon? I myself think it is worth it simply for the presentation of Enter the Dragon, which is phenomenally better than what Warner Brothers has done before on Blu-ray. It's a beautiful new scan, and the film's original mono mix being restored from the original magnetic stems and sounding as good as it does, I think is, again, worth the purchase price alone, which, when it's on sale, is very inexpensive for all the features you're getting, and far less than some of what the previous box sets and releases have cost. So I think it's a really great package overall. It's not definitive because it would be almost impossible to make a definitive Bruce Lee collection that had every previous extra and every last scrap of material or information, and then on top of that, what could it possibly bring new to the table with all of that? Myself, personally, the only real drawbacks to this release, I personally think, are the films based on the Ritrovata Masters, where they don't necessarily really jibe with my idea of what the color timing would be like. There are some instances where it does look like the Shout Factory versions of those particular titles look a little better in places, but then it's a trade-off because there are elements where, or points where the Criterion versions look better than what the Shout Factory versions do. And again, it's all going back to retiming those particular masters. So that's just, again, two different methodologies of how that was handled. I wish it included the old Warrior's Journey documentary with the original assembly of the Game of Death footage. That's my only qualm with the extras. And it would have been nice to have possibly licensed some of the older commentaries, but again, that may have not been possible due to various DVD rights and things like that. Just to get more of all the various commentaries in one place, because there are a great number of commentaries that have been recorded for these particular films. And then the question becomes, will these films ever get upgraded to UHD? Because you already have, all of them, except for Enter the Dragon, have been scanned at 4K. Of course, not talking about Game of Death 2, because that's just really tacked on here. It's not technically linked with the rest of the films. But that's a really good question. Fortune Star and Cameron Ronson and a lot of other companies in their realm have always been, shall we say, not the greatest at technological upgrades. Seeing a standard def upscale to Blu-ray like Game of Death 2 on here is much more their typical process, the way they do things. So to even have them do 4K scans and then release them on Blu-ray and license them to boutique labels is already big news. But it is now definitely possible, and definitely a matter of time before some of these films might eventually hit UHD. I don't know if that would be from Criterion or would be anytime soon, but since there are finished 4K masters, it's a definite possibility. However, Enter the Dragon would be something else, since Warner MPI did it at 2K, and so then there would have to be additional work or perhaps upscaling to get to 4K resolution. So for at least most of the Bruce Lee films, it is possible for them to get UHDs. It's just unknown at this point whether that will be anytime in the near future. So those are my thoughts on Criterion's release of Bruce Lee, His Greatest Hits. I think it's one of Criterion's better box set packages. I think the extras chosen and the new extras created give you a real crash course in Lee's filmography and his career, the importance and the legacy of the work that he achieved. And you do get a greater sense of the person behind the icon, if you want to use that sort of terminology, which is always something harder to do because, as said in Banish at Liberty Valance, when choosing between the legend and fact, print the legend. The legend is what always gets repeated and told over and over and over again. So it's very hard to sort of distance yourself from that and look at things from a historical archival perspective and look at the films with a fresh eye, but also look at the person and the artist behind them and not the legacy and the icon that's been submitted in stone for all these years. So I think you do get a greater sense of the person Bruce Lee was and the artist he was, in addition to the philosopher he was. And that was the greatest takeaway I had from the set. I'd always meant to really dive into his filmography. Again, it was just something I always kind of put off because I knew I'd have to track down different versions and look for better versions, and then there were so many different editions and cuts floating around. So when the Criterion set was released, I realized it was finally time to correct that and really dive deeply into his filmography. And as unfortunately short as it was, there is such a wealth of material and so many fans of these films that there is a great deal to go through and understand, and then understand the impact and the legacy that they had that has been so long ranging. So it's not just that you're talking about 4.5 films. It's a whole lot more than that, and that I think is explained at least somewhat by the number of extras that are here in the Criterion release, both new and legacy and older extras. So I think it is, again, one of Criterion's best box sets to date on the Blu-ray format. It is, a much more popular title because these are not necessarily the more niche art house type titles that Criterion is known for. This set, when it was announced and originally released, it was very difficult to get a hold of because there were so many fans trying to get copies that it caused shortages, because it is a real iconic set of films that are known and beloved the world over. And that's, again, why there are so many versions and editions, and it takes a little while to piece all that together and to really dig into that material. So I do think Criterion has done a rather impressive job with these, and again, I do think it is one of their better Blu-ray box sets, which is saying something, and especially at the price point it's at, and even more so if you're looking at getting a copy during one of the Criterion sales. It is beyond worth its price point, and you will return to these films time and time again and always be amazed and astounded by the energy, the vitality, and the intensity of both the man and artist Bruce Lee was. So that's why I think that the His Greatest Hits box set from Criterion is the overall best presentation of his filmography to date on home video. It may not be 100% definitive because it doesn't have every last extra and item from other releases, and there are some color timing quibbles with those particular transfers, but all that aside, I think Criterion has done the best job of anybody yet at packaging these films and really continuing the legacy of Bruce Lee's filmography. So that's it for this particular review. I hope you found it informative and maybe somewhat helpful. If you yourself have checked out the Criterion Bruce Lee box set, Please leave your comments below. I always love to hear from you guys. And if you love the Shout presentation, I'd love to hear from you about how you think the Shout versions compare to the Criterion version, especially in the varying transfers in terms of how the color timing was handled in the 4K masters on some of these films. So I would love to hear your direct opinions if you have any about the Shout releases as well. And with that, so I can let in the telephone repairman, I want to say thank you ever so much for watching.